Hello, everybody. My name is Martin Bean. I am a Professor of Digital Education and Emeritus Professor at RMIT University here in Australia. But my life's work in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Australia and Asia has always been about the intersection of technology and education. And probably, it's going to sound very geeky, but my great love in life is skills and how we can make sure that our citizens, our communities, our economies, our world is taking the friction out of the ability for individuals to get the skills that they need to realize their hopes and aspirations, but also the skills that our communities and economies need to be successful. And it's just a pleasure to partner with Concentric Sky and Badger in delivering this session today. And I'd like to welcome all of you to the session. That the headline is Readying Learners for the New World of Work. Today we're going to discuss how digital badges are advancing skills-based education and hiring to meet the challenge and opportunities of the new world of work. And I've got three really special guests joining me today. And I have to tell you, in our preparation for our webinar today, it has been such an amazing journey of discovery for me to get to know these people and just understand the amazing work that they've been driving for their constituents. And I'm sure you'll enjoy hearing what they've got to say. Firstly, Andrew, can I welcome you? Dr. Andrew Fisher is Vice President of Academic Affairs at NHTI's Concord Community College, where he supports instructional practice for 92 programs of study across the college. But Andrew is also a principal lead in the establishment of a statewide professional badging system that documents student learning in both non-credit and credit-bearing environments at all New Hampshire community colleges. And I'm seeing that more and more and more around the world is system-level restructuring, reform, and adaptation to serve our citizens more effectively. So welcome to you, Andrew. It's brilliant to have you. Next up is our special guest. We've got Dr. Gwen Britton. Hey, Gwen, good to have you here. Gwen has worn multiple leadership hats at Southern New Hampshire University and is a longtime champion of competency-based education and learner-centered innovations. And if I could stress one thing in my chats with Gwen, she is all about putting the learner at the center of most of our interventions. And I'm really looking forward, Gwen, to getting you to tease out really some of the benefits, not just for the institution, but for that learner. She currently serves as Vice President of Product Strategy, previously serving as Academic Associate Vice President of SNHU's online STEM and business programs. So a huge welcome to you as well, Gwen. And then third, helping me introduce and moderate today is Dr. Cheryl Grant. Hello, Cheryl. Lovely to have you here.
Nice to see everybody.
Cheryl is the Director of Digital Credentialing Strategies at Badger. But more importantly, Cheryl is among the change agents who helped build the field of micro-credentials and spearheaded the Open Badges movement 12 years ago now, if you can believe it, Cheryl. It doesn't feel like 12 years. And she did that alongside wonderful organizations like Mozilla, the MacArthur Foundation, and Hashtag. And I've just learned so much from Cheryl about how this movement all began, but more importantly, what were the underlying hopes, dreams, aspirations, and rules of engagement that she and others have fostered to create what we're talking about today. Cheryl's going to be going off camera in a moment to watch the chat box and interact with you in the chat box. And I'll be bringing her back in before our time is done to pose some questions from all of you to the group, says he, pausing. I hope that wasn't too fast for everybody. You've got a highly caffeinated bean this morning here in Australia, so we'll see how we go. But Andrew and Gwen, are you ready? Good. Mute button's off. Here we go. So I'd like to kick off by asking each of you, and Gwen, I'll go to you first, to tell me a little bit about your institution. We've got people from all over the world in our session today, so some may not be as familiar with just how world famous your institution actually is, Gwen. But what are your credentialing challenges, but also what are you focused on? What are you currently focusing on? Would you mind doing that for me, Gwen?
Oh, sure. So like you said, the learners are at the center of our world. and trying to find a way to really help learners articulate what the skills and competencies are that they're acquiring, so that when they're going out into that world of work, they have a really clear vocabulary to be able to articulate what those things are that they're doing. And I think one of the challenges that we run into as an academic institution is that we don't typically speak in competencies and skills. We speak in learning outcomes. We speak in, program outcomes, those sorts of things. And those oftentimes don't translate to the thing that you can know, show, and be able to do in the world of work. So I think that's one of the things that we've been really excited about tackling with learners, is to be able to give them that vocabulary. And in order to do that, we also then have to shift the vocabulary amongst the true academics in our world, because we do speak in outcomes and we do speak in, programmatic. We don't speak in that same language. So that's been, I would say, our biggest challenge. And we're getting there slowly but surely. And then the other challenge too is the underlying infrastructure that holds all of those things and the ability to make everything interoperable. So I would say those are our big rocks that we've been working
and really, I often describe it as helping take the friction out of the system, Gwen. Yeah. Which really means we do need to do a better job of having a common language, don't we? Sort of helping describe what it is that we do as education providers, how we equip our learners, but then give them a language to be able to really describe in a more fulsome way the skills and competencies that they've got, so that employers then really understand the whole person and all of the attributes that they've got. Is that fair?
Oh, absolutely. Spot on.
Yeah. Yeah, but then you touch on the fact that part of that is around the people and process, which I actually think is the toughest part, but that underlying technology then that can act as the mechanics of doing that at scale. How many students do you have at your institution, Gwen, roughly?
Oh, that's a really good question. I want to say we're probably over the 170,000 mark, probably even higher than that.
Yeah. So by world standards, mega. But it actually doesn't really matter whether you're mega like your institution or a smaller institution. Absent of the people, the processes, and the technology to enable it, it's going to be very difficult to get it to work in a sustainable way, I suspect, Gwen. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And, part of the challenge also is that as an academic institution of higher ed, the way we store information, the way we share information is really regimented in a lot of ways, but it doesn't mean that we can't acknowledge achievement in different ways as opposed to just a transcript. Yeah. So, and I don't mean just a transcript to make that sound like it's less than something amazing that it really is, but a different way of actually acknowledging that achievement that's shareable in smaller bursts is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if you look at all the studies of the world of work right now, not even the future, sort of rough numbers, but let's say 9 out of the 12 top in-demand competencies are more of those durable, what often get described as soft skills. I like to think of them as human skills, and being able to evidence that for our students and our graduates in a way that industry understands obviously helps tremendously. Thank you, Gwen. So Andrew, your turn. Tell us a bit about your institution, but really what are the credentialing challenges that you're focused on?
Sure. NHCI is actually, I don't know, probably 15 miles down the road, Gwen, from where you guys are at?
Not very far.
Not very far at all. We could line up all 105,000 students and we could make a train. No, just joking. But we are just right down the road. But what's interesting, so our institution, a little over 3,000 students. So like I said, we offer 92 programs. And so you can see kind of the need for having some type of a credentialing system that allows us to dig in a little deeper into what it is that students are able to do. Because when you have that many students with that many programs, you got to be really clear in terms of your conversation with students about what it is that they're learning, right? And so we came to badging as a product of another college within our system. There are 7 colleges within the community college system of New Hampshire, and White Mountains Community College was piloting this really interesting solution for the restaurant industry. So during COVID, there was opportunity for some additional training to become proficient in COVID safe protocols. And so they offered this additional training that was out there. And we saw a lot of utilization from different restaurants. The restaurants themselves could become certified as COVID safe restaurants and so on and so forth. And so with the early success of that within the system, it became clear that the community college system really needed to figure out this space. Because we recognize that there is utility for digital assets and for learning assets in these badges. So having moved from an institution previous that was engaged in this work, it seemed like a great almost alignment of stars that I happened to be here and said, hey, I will gladly help in any way that I can. And so with that, then the system launched pretty quickly. And so each of our institutions now is providing digital asset documentation through badges, using the badging platform, Badger platform. And right now we're landing in a couple areas. And so, yes, we're doing full non-credit credentials. So if you go through our workforce center and complete a credential opportunity, that not only do you still get a certificate, but then you get a digital asset that you can push out. But also we're pushing in other spaces as well. So we're pushing in micro-credential spaces. We're pushing in areas of learning outcomes and documentation with specific learning outcomes. And we're even pushing on co-curricular aspects. Giving students an opportunity to demonstrate academic proficiency or learning experience outside of the classroom. It's kind of a hallmark of what we do in higher education. But up to this point, largely, we've been silent on articulating to students what it is that they can learn and participate in outside of the classroom. You had asked for some challenges specifically. I think anytime you launch a solution, there's an automatic response to that solution. And that automatic response is centered around a couple camps. And usually there's the traditional camp that says that we don't need this, it's never going to work. And then there's the other camp that's invigorated by the ideas of bringing something new on campus, because it gives them an opportunity to think through the processes of why they do what they do, and then provides, again, a little deeper introspection into what happens in the classroom and why it is we have these credentials all together. I would say that our system is no different, right? That we have both of those camps that are out there. And so that stands as both a challenge, but also an opportunity. To watch the growth within the community that's really adopting this tool set and is trying to figure out different and innovative ways to put it into practice to help and support students. So I'd say that's probably the biggest one we face is people.
So awesome, thank you. So two quick follow-ups for you. First on the co-curricular, which I totally agree with. In fact, I'm working with a lot of secondary schools right now in how they can use digital badging to help evidence competency based on some of the co-curricular activities. But can you give us a couple of examples of the co-curriculars that you've focused on and how you've gone about it from a sort of a methodology and assessment perspective, Andrew?
Yeah, so the one that is the coolest one that we're working on right now here on our campus is actually library studies and library integration. And so we've got a meeting coming up this Friday that we're really going to further develop this and get it off and running. But the idea and concept behind it is that oftentimes faculty members will bring students to the library to learn study skills, to learn how to use the resources and facilities, and they take up an entire class session in order to do this. And sometimes students will attend this same library session 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times, depending on who they have as faculty members and professors. And it appears as if through co-curricular documentation that you can essentially have a student participate in either an independent module where they get certified as having this educational experience on how to do research in the library, or maybe by the instance of one class and thereby saving that student the obligation to go to the class each individual time. And so I think the hardest part for co-curricular is there's a lot of really cool things that are out there with co-curricular, either transcripts or learning assets or this, that, or whatever. But the gap that is hardest to bridge is oftentimes finding the utilization. Congratulations, you're a student senate secretary. Let's badge you for that. Right, we need to document that. But then what does that do for the student? For this particular solution, the interesting aspect of it is that it actually serves in surrogate for another classroom experience. And because the student is able to do something and demonstrate something, then it changes their interaction in another course. And that's really kind of what we're looking for when we look at integration of some of these digital assets, is what can it do? Not so much what does it stand for. The what does it stand for? That's fairly straightforward. I mean, I can dodge the tomatoes, but it's pretty straightforward. It's what can these assets do that is the critical question.
And for many of those skills and competencies, Andrew, of course, they can be expressed to the world of work as valuable competencies, in addition to the value within the institution in the example that you've just given as well. Jumping across to something else that you said, and Gwen, I might get you to comment on this as well before we go to the next sort of section of our conversation. We, or everybody listening in on this workshop today, some have already actively gone through it, some have got them ahead of them. But if you are introducing digital badges and alternative credentials into your institution, you are going to hit those people resistors, Andrew. And most of them I've found are incredibly well-intentioned. The questions they're asking, the barriers they're putting up, are because they genuinely want to be convinced that this is a good idea. Do you have any pearls of wisdom, Andrew, about the way you've engaged the resistance to help move them through the change process? And Gwen, you get a little bit more time to think, but I'm coming to you with that question as well.
I was going to say, why don't you have Gwen go first? No, but this is for some people a very threatening thing, right? It does get at the heart of some very difficult questions, which is that as faculty members in the classroom, there are some performance expectations. We generally document those through learning outcomes and or grades, right? And this is a critical performance aspect of the reason why that you are a faculty member, right? And so in some respects, a lot of the same movements that were around 15 years ago when learning outcomes were being forced into the classroom because of accreditors, and there was this mass revolt of how dare you look in my classroom and don't you trust me? And this is an issue of rigor and all those things. Once that storm passed, faculty members were able to see that there's actually tremendous benefit on an individual level and also as a departmental level to understanding the experiences of students as they consume the educational experience. Not so much what you're doing, but as it's consumed. And that's what learning outcomes do. These digital assets are nothing more than a further enhancement of that and further opportunity. These are skill-based tools. These are tools and opportunities to document student learning wherever it happens, right? Doesn't necessarily have to happen in a very, very specific way. And once faculty members begin to feel the pressure of that being released, of understanding that asset documentation is really not that far of a derivative from just simply reporting learning outcomes, that takes a lot of the sting out of it, in my opinion.
No, I agree. And the fact that technologies like Badger is so well integrated into mainstream learning management systems, it means they don't have to sit to the side. They can actually be embedded in the overall instructional design and data sets that help us do a better job with the learner as well. Gwen, from your perspective, what tactics have you used to win over, or to sort of, you won't win everybody over. That's one of Martin Bean's golden rules in running universities and higher education institutions. You'll never get everybody on board, but how can you get the fence sitters to come on board, Gwen?
That's a great question. I think it's a lot of it, again, is the commonality of language and taxonomies and ontologies and how all the pieces and parts fit together and why it's so important to be able to articulate things in a common way. So when you start thinking about, an institution where you have 170,000 students, think about how many different faculty members you have that are, teaching the same kind of topics. And the only way to ensure that we are giving our learners that same level of rigor and assessment and engagement, I need to make sure that there's a common language and common taxonomy between the two of them, so that here's the competencies I know the learners are going to be working on. Here's the skills that I need them to demonstrate to prove that they have this competency. And using this underlying competency taxonomy allows me to equate those things. So I know if they went through this learner, this teacher, and this teacher, they're going to end up with that same level of competence. And the digital credentials allow us to really surface that in an interoperable way within our own institution. But the other part of that too is it also allows our faculty to talk to each other in more constructive way, not necessarily more constructive ways, but different ways. So when you start listening to some of the conversations about assessment, gee, I'm going to assess the learner on these skills in this way because of the pedagogy that I'm using, doesn't mean you have to assess the learners in exactly the same way because your pedagogy might be different. The bottom line is you're assessing the learners in the way that makes the most sense, but you're still aligning them to that same skills competency taxonomy. So that's really how I've been able to get buy-in.
Can I hop on there?
Yes, Andrew.
Yeah, and draw a connection. And so what this does then is that with this level of granularity and documentation, now Gwen and I can have a conversation about a student in between our institutions.
Exactly.
Whereas before, the only conversation we could have was that they got a C in college algebra, which while well-intentioned is fairly, there's a lot of boundaries around any assumptions that you would make about that grade. You know, do they understand 100% of the material at a 70% level, or do they understand 70% of the material at 100% level? This is actually a pretty important question. We don't know what it is going on and what learning has happened in the classroom historically, but now we can. And that high level of fidelity of conversation between institutions is important for transfer's sake, but it's also important for identifying student needs. Right. And so a student leaving our institution and going to Gwen's institution would be able to quickly identify, we've got a student who likely could be at risk because, and so we will scaffold a structure around this student's in terms of a support system to help this student to be successful. Whereas 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, the student just would have transferred over and maybe your early alert system would have picked up something, or maybe it wouldn't have. Right. And so now we're not leaving that to chance, or we have the opportunity not to leave that to chance. We have the opportunity to have very deep conversations about the durability of learning that's happening for these students, regardless of where it happens.
Excellent.
Yeah, look, just what an awesome set of comments, and maybe to sort of summarize just a couple of the points that you've made, but you can start to see how taking digital badges and forming them in pathways can actually solve program issues of articulation within our institutions and students moving more flexibly across the programs that we offer. Your point that you just made, Andrew, that Gwen was nodding on, it also allows at a system level for us to take the various players, whether they are, you know, sort of community colleges articulating to 4-year institutions, vocational providers, industry certifications, and mapping them into our pathways of learning. You start to see how that structured data that the micro-credentials and digital badges create for us, if properly curated, sort of is the solution to much of the complexity that we've been wrestling with probably forever in formal higher education. And I think for the people on our webinar today, I think it's really important that you realize there's power in the individual badge, but oh my goodness, when you map that and build that as a series of pathways and connected pathways, it somewhat revolutionizes the way we think about the ability for a student to move through the institution, but also between institutions and on to lifelong learners. So fantastic. So we're going to move a little bit now. We're going to start thinking about really trying to net it out for our participants today about the benefits of micro-credentialing and digital badging for 3 core constituents. So, and we've talked about some of it already, but Gwen, I'm going to come to you first, but I really want you to sort of net out for us what you believe the benefits are for the learner, for the employer, I'll call them that right now, an employer with a big E, because it could be all sorts of different types of employers. And then why don't we just finish then for the institution? When you're talking to your head of institution or your governing council, how would you describe the real benefits for the institution? So learner, employer, and institution. Over to you, Gwen.
Excellent question. So many benefits, right? As we start to build out competencies and skills frameworks within our own institution, and we have the ability to use digital credentials to acknowledge what those are, exactly to Andrew's point before, we have the ability to connect different kinds of things together. So as you start introducing open linked connected data, that really opens up a world for all three of those constituents, right? So I noticed that Deb Everhart from Credential Engine was on the call, and Deb and I have this amazing relationship, and we're using Credential Engine, and that's really allowing us to take a look at how data is organized so we can make connections, and it gives us the ability to use a language that allows us to connect things together. So using a strength of fit analysis, this has got a major connection, this is a minor connection, this is a whatever connection. So using the same kind of data standards and taxonomies lets us connect all three of those things together. So picture in the future when the world of education starts building out these comprehensive learner employment records. So the example I'll use is I recently went to Grand Cayman, which, by the way, if you ever get a chance, was just amazing and awesome. And in order for me to actually get there, I had to use my health record to show what my vaccine status was, any COVID tests I had, et cetera. And if I had that same kind of a wallet available to me as a learner, I could put all my digital credentials in there and I could share those with employers, and I can pick and choose which stuff I share and why I share it. An employer then, if I opened it up to them, they would be able to actually take a look at, oh, let me see what kind of skills and competencies you have to see where my match is. And then as an academic institution, it allows me to really put that learner at the center so that I can help curate the right pathway for them so that they can get to whatever that goal is faster by bringing in whatever those linked digital acknowledgements are. So they may not need to spend, 2 years doing this piece of their degree. It's highly possible that there's a credential that lives in a certification land that would plug in as part of their degree program. And all of those things would talk to each other. And it would make it much more interoperable across all three of those systems.
Fantastic.
So yay. Okay, sorry.
And just talk to me just a little bit more about the value to the employer then, Gwen. When you talk to an industry leader about why this matters to them, what do you say?
So when you talk to them, lots of different conversations. You might talk to an employer and they say, well, we have these 5 jobs. That's wonderful. That's great that you have those jobs. What are the skills that you are looking for to hire from? They'll then be able to give us that information. We then can kind of take a look at what are those job openings they have, what are the skills and the competencies. I can align them directly to what I already have in my catalog, or I can quickly, if I've created a really large library of competencies and skills, I may be able to curate a pathway that's going to help them get learners to their pathway faster or help them upskill the employees that they have.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And it goes back to something I said before about taking the friction out of the system, right? It's about doing a much better job at matchmaking and getting the right fit and removing all of that horrible bias that is in the system right now, where people are inappropriately assessed instead of being assessed on their actual skills and competencies. Interestingly, Gwen, right now, the Australian government is building and investing in both a national credentials platform. So every citizen will have their digital wallet of their formal and informal qualifications, but they're also investing in a national micro-credentials marketplace to actually allow a place for education providers to present their alternative credentials and the labor market to be able to do a better job of getting line of sight to the talent that they need. Now, we've got a long way to go, but I think it's just one national example of what we will start seeing all over the world. And we're already seeing it in many states in the United States right now as well. So Andrew, your turn. Net out for us the benefits to the learner, the employer, and the institution, if you can. You've touched on some of them already, but I really want to try to net it out for our participants today.
Right. I think learners come to us, students come to us, they have specific expectations. And really gone are the days of trust me education. When you say, well, you've got to take these credits and take this English and then take this English, and then they're going to say, but why? Right. So the trust me is out. Right. And so you have to be very clear with students why they have to engage in the educational experiences that they have to engage in. Right. And there's a great benefit to that. Also, I think something that comes as a byproduct of this as well is that we've set up as an institution pretty clear success marks. And we say, if you make to the end of the semester, then you're eligible for a success marker. But then what happens to that student who is 6 weeks in, has a car wreck, is not able to finish, has absolutely learned things up to that point and has demonstrated competencies. Up to this point, we shrug our shoulders and we say, well, come on back and then try it again and start all the way back over. Well, that's not actually accurate to the student's experiences, right? Because the student has learned things. And so this type of an approach provides a very, a lot of fidelity in what it is that's going on underneath the hood. And it allows us to be honest with students and their educational experiences, but it also allows students to be honest with themselves about their educational experiences and giving themselves credit for things that they absolutely have been able to demonstrate as part of their educational experience. The second one you'd asked about employers, I think I'm going to make a broad generalization. I think the traditional credential in higher education has served as a very easy sorting tool for employers to simply say, you have to have an associate's degree, you have to have a bachelor's degree, you have master's preferred, with no real thought into the reasons why we need to have these key marks of demarcation. Sometimes it's financially driven. Well, we can't afford to pay somebody with a terminal degree, and so we can only afford this, so let's ask for a bachelor's degree. But I think what happens more often than not is that the surrogate experiences, or almost like the heuristical experiences of the employer, is now putting them onto the future employee. And they're saying, when I was in college, I learned some of this stuff. And I got a bachelor's degree, and I want my employees to know some of this stuff. And so I think they need a bachelor's degree. Well, that's the wrong way to go about answering that question, right? And it's going to lead to a lot of false positives. However, it is a really easy sorting tool, right? To just say you have to have a master's or a bachelor's or an associate's degree or skill-based trade or something along those lines. I think something that the way that it changes for employers is based on some pretty simple numbers. ADP did this really great study. It's now a couple years old about they surveyed 2.6 million employment credentials, and they found that there were errors in the degree of attainment of education in 23% of those data sets. So which means people are probably willfully exaggerating what degrees they have up to 23%. Now, sometimes it could have been error, right? But this is a pretty big data set, right? Considering that we care so much about our records that we lock them down, we kick students out for cheating, plagiarism, like we want the record to be accurate. So, and then it gets even worse when you look at those that have had provided some level of questionable information or discontinuous information with their educational experiences. That number goes up to 41. So if 23 are willing to put it on paper and 41% are willing to exaggerate it just a little bit, how much is this sorting system actually helping employers? And I think it's clear. The answer is probably not a lot, because they're getting folks coming to their industry or to their workplace and business, and it's just not what it was like for them, right? They just don't quite know those things. Well, digital badging or digital-based credential solution helps ferret out some of that nonsense, right? And it gives the employer an opportunity to make decisions not based on how they feel about some experiences they've had in the past, but rather to sit down and say, I need an employee who can blah, 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 blah. Anybody got this out there? And then they can go to either repositories, they could look at some OSN, they could look at like all these different areas to try to identify what it is what they're looking for. And that's going to make for a happier employer and a happier employee. For the institution, it makes us feel good because we're the part of this process that it makes the most sense for us to be in, right? We're educating students, doing it the right way, and providing credentials that are pretty much free of error or any question. And that's kind of the foundations of what higher education actually is, right? To provide that education and then to provide proof for the student in a trust-based validation system. So kind of a long-winded approach, but
No, that's absolutely perfect. And it goes back, Andrew, to something that Gwen said that I know based on our prior conversations, you agree with as well. And that's why it is so important, once you've done your people and your process steps, to pick the enabling technology that's going to be able to support that entire solution. And so if you look at something like the badger technology that we all use, it allows you to go as sophisticated as you need to based on the needs of your institution. And once you start really betting on it for your structured data repository of your credentials, it needs to be robust enough to really be able to support complex pathways and outcomes. But also, to your point, Andrew, it's one thing to confer the badge. It's another thing entirely to be able to describe it in a fulsome way, with the permission of the user, to express it to the world, but then for the employer to seamlessly be able to come back and not only verify it, understand what they're verifying, what it was that this individual demonstrated and how that was assessed. And for all of those people on the workshop today, we get overly fixated with the badge as the image file and how it looks. It's actually the underlying data and the ability to truly understand the achievement of the learner that is what a digital badge is all about. And if you take nothing else away, if you're new to this, don't focus on the image, focus on that rich underlying data and what it unlocks for everything that Andrew and Gwen have just talked about. We're not far away before I'm going to Cheryl, who's going to ask some fantastic questions that are coming through in the chat. But my final one as your host is the number one question I get asked in the work that I do now is, okay, so how do you define what should be badged and what shouldn't be badged? What's quality and what's not? And who should be given the right in the institution to issue a badge or not issue a badge? In other words, how do we, because you get to a point that the three of us have experienced where it's no longer fighting through the resistance. Suddenly everybody's on board and everybody wants to badge everything. So Gwen, how do you put the guardrails or sort of the rules around digital badging and alternative credentials?
The reason I chuckled is because you're right. The minute the floodgates open, it's the Wild West, and there are the weirdest, wackiest ideas for badges, right? So what we ended up doing is we really had to kind of take a look at what is it that people wanted to badge and why did they want to badge it? And did they really understand the power of the metadata behind the scenes? So we ended up kind of taking a look at that. And there's different kinds of badges, right? So there's a merit badge because, I made it up 6 flights of stairs and I'm still breathing, right? So I deserve a badge for that. I definitely deserve a badge for that. But that's not the same kind of a badge that is going to be acknowledged with something that could be traded in for an academic credential, right? So we put together a framework and a taxonomy for here's the different flavors of badges that are available. That's what this kind is for. And we actually did a whole branding strategy, right? The shape, the color, the size. So you can actually see that this might be a merit badge because I was able to make up, 6 flights of stairs. And this one might be possibly able to, if you collect it with 2 more, could be then tied into something that you could count for academic credit in an academic pathway. And what's really interesting is the framework that we're using with competencies and skills and our assessment framework, where you are going to be tying in those essential skills to whatever that assessment is. You also have to have a way to verify and validate the level at competency demonstration with here's the assessment they did. This is how we measured whether or not the learner was competent. This badge will show you at what level of competence they've made it. Did they get these 3 skills or did they only get these 2 skills? So while they may show they're competent in this area, they still need to work on this one skill. That acknowledgement and the badging framework and structure that we put together is pretty solid. So it's really hard to get a weird badge that doesn't mean something, but there's certain badges that you can cash in for credit and other badges that are just merit badges.
Yep. Thank you, Gwen. And making sure that you're clear to the outside world and the inside world, those distinctions, and actually doing the heavy lifting of really filling in the appropriate templates that people will read when they come back to look at what the badge is, how it was issued, what level attainment, what assessment. I think that's extremely good advice, because remember, it's our brands that are on these badges. That And our brands and what we stand for in our communities is very valuable. They're markers of quality in our communities. So same to you, Andrew. How have you managed badge happiness?
We have a system-based committee that gets together every month, and then we kind of chat. Right now, it's a fairly informal process about what get badges and what doesn't get a badge. I don't know that we're really seeing any that didn't pass muster, but again, it will likely happen. I wish that there was governance in the space, but right now there's not. There may be institutions that have within their policy systems definitions of micro-credentials and how badges are earned. There may be, but it's probably slim pickings, in higher education. And so in some cases, this technology has outpaced the policy that's out there. And so institutions would be well disposed to make some pretty clear decisions early on as to what these things mean, what they stand for, and how they can be used. I think the easy answer is to say, like, who's the outside person that's going to come in and tell us this stuff? But that's actually the wrong approach. And the reason why that's the wrong approach is because of the deep, meaningful conversations that happen as a result of analysis and evaluation. When you start to have conversations about what badges mean, then you can't have that conversation without also talking about what do your degrees mean. Right. And those are very, very important conversations to have at the local level to talk about. If somebody gets a grade in a class, what's the meaning of that grade in the class? How is it applied, and what are we doing with this, and how do we validate? Those are extremely important conversations to have. So any institution that rushes to application without considering this a tool, meaning that they just want a solution and so they can put it in place because everybody else at the state has a badging solution and I don't, so let's put one in. I think you will have missed some pretty critical development that likely means that you're building a fragile system that probably won't last very long.
Yeah, like I just could not agree more with both of you. And so I call it the heavy lifting, Andrew, that, you've got to be prepared to have the debate, sort of set up the rules of engagement and create an enabling environment with minimum standards is the way that I think of it. But do that very much in a way that it's guidance to help people be successful rather than policing it. So it is all about helping do knowledge transfer so that people understand the why, they deeply understand the how, and you set up the minimums and let them run then as hard and fast as they want to run for the sake of the learner, the institution, and the outside world. All right, Cheryl, I'm going to be asking you to come back on camera now. There you are. We have got a lot of questions, don't we, Cheryl? So we're going to do our best to get back to people afterwards because we won't get through them all with some of the questions that are there. But Cheryl, I'm handing the mic to you now, and I'll let you ask some of our participant questions to Gwen and Andrew and I.
This is conferring a lot of power to me, so I hope I get this get these questions framed right. I did sort of move them around a little bit as people were asking, just to try and put some themes together. I think Elaine and Karen are asking questions that can go together, so I've put them together. How do we get employers to recognize the badge, which seems like a very tactical question? And then maybe a little bit more broadly, if we are talking about the learn to earn marketplace, that next piece that is sort of coming into place. In my mind, it almost seems like open badges 10 years ago, in a sense, from the data standards piece. But how close are we to making the LER marketplace a reality?
Okay, super. Gwen, do you want to grab those first, and then we'll come to Andrew?
Yeah, I'll talk about employers. And I think that's also a very interesting conversation. So a lot of times speaking to the hiring managers is the right place to go. Because as you start thinking about larger enterprises, most of them have an HRM system, which they need to keep track of all of the jobs and the job postings they have in there. And many of those HRM systems use the same kind of a mindset, right? They've got like a skills cloud, and they attach those skills clouds to those job postings. And that's how they tell whether or not somebody's got relevant skills and competencies. So having that level of a conversation with an HR person is really eye-opening, because they don't expect you to have that conversation. They have you, they expect you to say, well, which degrees fit my thing? And I'm going to come recruit students from your school because your graduates always fit the bill. Wrong conversation. The conversation again is, well, tell me how you do your classification system with your HR system. Tell me how you actually write those job postings. Where do you get the information that you're putting on there? And let me show you how a badge can help you find what you're looking for. So that's really kind of changing the approach of the conversation. In terms of the LERs, that's a really good question. I think, again, there are lots of different organizations having conversations. And, do you do a comprehensive learner record? Do you do a learner employment record? And are you going to adhere to this standard? Are you going to adhere to that standard? The bottom line is the conversations are starting to happen. And there's lots of different organizations that are out there that are not just building the one wallet. They're building the wallet that will allow all of the different parties to connect them together. So how can an employer tie into this network of all of these other learner employment records? How do the educational systems tie in? How do the learners tie in so that you're sharing all of that information? So it's starting to happen. And I think it just really depends on where you're at, what people know and understand. The biggest challenge has been, and I will be honest, it's been a good, 2 years. And I really was getting sick of being the skills evangelist until people actually started getting that aha moment. Now I know what you're talking about, Gwen. Now I understand why these digital credentials are so important. Now I get why there should be a learner employment record, but it's been a slow go. So I know I kind of went off on a tangent.
That's great, Gwen. Thank you. Andrew, your thoughts?
Yeah, getting employers to buy in is hard. So it's got to, make their life easier or save them money. There's got to be some real tangibles. Again, I think the space has the opportunity to do both that, do those two things plus more. The interesting thing is if you build a repository or build some kind of a means by which that an employer can consume and get this information, not just through LinkedIn or not just because it's on a digital app or something like that, then I think it changes the conversation. If we're badging folks through our local home builders inspection association, and our students are getting certifications and badges in different areas, and then me as a potential employer is looking for someone to do an inspection for me that can do commercial HVAC, and I could go somewhere and find somebody because they have these specific skills, then I think that changes the conversation altogether, because that enhances the utility of it. I think it's the same thing with the LER too, is that LER, moving into the space, I knew it was probably the same with Gwen. I mean, it was something different, right? So like we wanted some kind of an educational record that could allow us to talk back and I'm not speaking for Gwen, that could allow us to talk back and forth between institutions. But then it was like, but wait, what about the employer? It's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And so maybe let's add employer to that. And so now I have LER as the kind of the common nomenclature. I know the ACRO is hard at work on this. I know that there are other certifying agencies that are hard at work at finding some kind of a way or means by which LER exchanges can happen. I don't have a crystal ball, but it'll probably be like the old days when everybody had different information systems about students and was producing transcripts differently. But then over time, we found some common ground, and through some third-party exchanges, then we have like Parchment, et cetera, we started to see some commonalities of information exchange. Like that'll probably happen in the space, but it'll probably take a while because I need my stuff to go to somebody. And right now our stuff is having a hard time going to somebody. And so the LER is a great conversation until there's widespread adoption. I think it's just a big question mark.
Yeah, fantastic. And one of the things that Andrew and Gwen and participants that I'm enjoying is it's forcing those conversations now. And they are really, really important conversations for higher education providers to be having with industry if we're to maintain our relevance in helping build the skills and capabilities and competencies of our citizens. So have the conversations, to your point, Andrew. Don't try to second guess it within the institution. And co-creation, wherever you can, is a very good thing from my perspective. Cheryl, what's our next question?
Well, kind of related to this, and I know you've all sort of touched on this in some way, but I do think it's nice to get a succinct answer, is how are employers assured of the actual quality of the micro-credential?
I get that asked so much, and it's not just employers, by the way. it's anybody relying upon the micro-credential for something. But Gwen, over to you.
That's a really great question. I think one of the things that has been wonderful as the digital badging standard has emerged is our ability to put in more robust information as the verifying body. So if a learner learns how to do something at this institution, we're recognized as an institution of higher education. So that kind of gives us a leg up for putting forward digital credentials, right? If we weren't an institution of higher education, that might be questionable. But even if a badge does not necessarily come with academic credit, our ability to clearly articulate, these are the skills that this person was able to demonstrate. Here's how we assess that person. And oh, by the way, here's an example of what those assessments look like. So you can actually go in and look and see what is the quality of that assessment. At what level did somebody have to demonstrate that? What are the things that we asked them to do to prove that they did that thing? So I think that's where you really are much better able to surface that level of competence that the person had to demonstrate to get the digital credentials. All in the metadata.
All in the metadata. I couldn't agree more. And also the quality of what you use from the metadata when they come to verify the badge. I couldn't agree more, Gwen. Andrew, from your perspective?
Yeah, so we, in as much as we can, we get employers to participate in the process. The NHBOA is a good example of that. So that's the Building Officials Association, is that they were moving what was a credit program to a non-credit program because they felt like that was going to make more sense for the type of education solution that they needed for employees in that space. And we asked them, what do you want? So what will you recognize? What's important to you? And that's what we're building out. Now, I recognize you can't do that all over the place, but in as much as there is that ground that's there, we should absolutely be asking the employers what it is that they want to see. Now, in cases where we can't do that, then we ought to be paying attention to those rich skill descriptors and other types of indicators that will serve as some kind of a translation tool to allow the employers to find what it is they're looking for. If they can't find what they're looking for in this and they don't find utilization, then it'll be really great that we've built this, but utility will really be stymied.
Thank you, Andrew. Cheryl.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in with my 2 cents. I think it's so different by sector. It's so different by sector and different by institutions. The ones that have very close relationships with employers they're quick to market. They're looking already at industry certifications and embedding those in pathways. So some different design parameters around this can really make a difference with the employer question. So I've got another question here, and I think this is jumping back earlier a little bit to our conversation about are the learning processes fundamentally different than regular classroom or online classes, or are you simply awarding digital credentials for regular coursework?
Great question. Gwen?
That's a really great question. So as part of our Taming the Wild West, that was a question that we really wrestled with, right? Do you automatically award a badge when somebody successfully completes a class? The answer to that is no. And the reason is, when you're going through a class and you successfully complete a class, you're already getting a credential. You have successfully passed a class, and therefore it's going to end up on your transcript as an academic engagement. You would be able to get a badge if you demonstrated the level of skill attainment that you needed in order to demonstrate that you had this competency. So it's highly possible you could pass a class, but you may not have earned all 3 of the badges along the way. That's just an example. Maybe you only earned 2 because, to Andrew's point earlier, I was able to get a 70. So I was able to pass 2 of those competencies, but I didn't pass the other competency that was in there, but I was still able to pass the class. So that's an example. I don't know if that would actually ever happen, but that's one way of ensuring that you're not handing out badges because you did this, because you're already given a different credential. So that's how it is in HU. Yeah.
Thank you, Gwen. Andrew?
I can say we're still exploring the space. So I don't know that our answer is going to be the same as Gwen's, right? The right now it's unclear if we're going to be giving badges at the course level. Right now, for sure, it's going to be at it is at the student learning outcome level, right? So we're still figuring that particular piece out. Again, I think that's part of the beauty of this system is that you can tune it for your individual specific needs. But largely speaking, the students are getting credit for the work they're doing in the class. And it is very similar to what they would have gotten a grade for, if they would have turned in an assignment or passed a test or so on and so forth.
Very good. Cheryl, we're down to our last 5 minutes here. I'm going to use host's prerogative and just do a rapid fire question. But if you think there's one other burning thing in the chat, Cheryl, I'll give you a chance to come in on the back end as well. But Gwen, coming to you first, 3 biggest lessons learned in your journey so far. And then to you, Andrew, 3 biggest lessons learned. Give us net out your wisdom to the group here.
People, pay attention to people, pay attention to how you articulate what's in it for them, pay attention to how they can make the magic happen, and then pay attention to how it might change their worlds in the future.
Brilliant. So very much around those internal stakeholders. Get that right, and then it'll be great for the learner and great for industry. Get that wrong, you'll never get to the learner in industry. So good advice, Gwen. Thank you. Andrew, yours.
Well, I'm going to say very similar too, and then add to that and just say, make as many friends as you can in the industry. That there's a lot of people who have spent a lot of time asking a lot of the same questions, and they have hard fought answers that they're more than willing to share. And so if you see somebody on a webinar in a meeting, reach out to them and ask them, right? And so building on people and then that, but then also to just take the yes and approach, and don't say no to everything, especially when you're starting out. Just say yes. And if you need to modify it, fine, modify it along the way. But you really do need internal champions, and you only get internal champions by saying yes.
Yeah. And Andrew, this whole movement that Cheryl and her colleagues started was built on some fundamental principles of openness, collaboration, shared experience, knowledge transfer. It's why I love efforts like the Open Skills Network that the Concentric Sky team are active supporters of, along with many, because you're absolutely right. This is a movement. This is something that we are all in together. It's not something that any one particular actor or set of actors should be setting up to try to control or steer. And so that advice, Andrew, of tap into the communities and sort of follow their lead was the genesis of these webinars. It's what Cheryl and I are trying to unlock, because the answers are all out there. It's just a matter of doing the networking and the collaborating. All right, Cheryl, 3 minutes. I'm going to give you the last word. Is there anything else that you think coming out of the chat that you just want to highlight today, or get a couple of quick pearls of wisdom from Andrew and Gwen?
We had so many more questions, and I think I can fit into a short period of time. So I'm going to just wrap up a little bit about what I think I'm seeing in the chat and what I've seen in the last 10 years. And it is really profound to me that both Andrew and Gwen are actually exemplifying what had been as abstract for us when we first started this work. So we sort of had a lot of the same stories, but it was just sort of a fiction at that point, because we had not yet built the standard. We hadn't created these platforms that can do some of this work. So it's really a full circle moment to hear people actually say, for example, the library skills comment that I think Andrew made, that sometimes you go through these courses many times. So some of those things, to hear those come up, it's just a reminder that sometimes this work does seem like it takes a long time, but you turn your head and you realize that time went by so quickly, and we now have full programs and 30,000 students and 60,000 students and really big student body populations that are benefiting from this work. I do feel like with the LER stuff and the employment questions that everybody's asking about, that we did really focus on the learner in this work. I mean, that was our primary language. That was the narrative that we were talking about. I think that employers, we were talking about this a little bit before the webinar, and I hope that we can just sort of wrap up with this. There is a desperation that I think is actually going to move this work forward much, much more quickly. I think there's many more employers that are leaning into this space, that are norming these inside their institutions. And they're going to start recognizing this new thing that's coming to them, however it gets to them. They're going to recognize there's something valuable here that I'm going to use to benefit my own company. So I feel like these things that we're in right now, I think Andrew may have used the word revolutionize, maybe it was you, Martin, or Gwen. It is a little bit what's happening right now is we're watching this tremendous change in the macro trends and also in this technology too. So I think we're seeing that in the questions in the chat, sort of like this same thing, like I want this now. And yes, we want it now. And we are seeing a lot of what we thought we were going to see 10 years ago, we're actually seeing now. And so same thing with the employer piece. I think we're just on the verge of it.
Thank you, Cheryl. We couldn't get to all of the questions, which is a really good sign. We will try to get back to you asynchronously with some answers, but more importantly, this is a rolling series of webinars, and Cheryl and I will take your questions and we'll use them as the backdrop to future webinars to make sure we get as many of them answered by our expert panels that we bring together as we can. To Gwen and Andrew and to Cheryl, thank you. What an awesome conversation and what a privilege for me to be part of it. So thank you to all of our participants today. Thanks for being here. Take very, very good care of yourselves and your families and those that you love. And I look forward to seeing you along with my colleagues at Concentric Sky and Badger at our next webinar. Take care, everybody. Bye for now.